The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Richardson's parade ground as Colonel Bradley Hancock surveyed the scene before him. Today was the annual inspection, a ceremony that would determine which units received the coveted Excellence in Leadership Awards. Everything had to be perfect. "Listen up, people," Colonel Hancock's voice boomed across the assembly area. "General Patricia Williams will be here in exactly 47 minutes. I want every uniform pressed, every boot polished, every salute crisp. This inspection determines our funding for the next fiscal year." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The soldiers snapped to attention, their movements sharp and coordinated. Among them, standing quietly at the far edge of the formation, was a man who seemed to blend into the background. Sergeant First Class Thomas Chen wore the same uniform as everyone else, but something about his posture suggested he'd rather be anywhere but here. Chen's uniform was regulation perfect but unremarkable. His boots carried the standard military shine, his hair was cut within specifications, and his bearing was correct but understated. To most observers, he appeared to be exactly what his personnel file indicated, a logistics specialist who managed supply inventories and maintained equipment records. "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Hancock's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "What are you doing in formation with the combat units?" Chen turned toward the colonel, his expression neutral. "Sir, I was ordered to report for inspection with my assigned company." "Your assigned company?" Hancock's eyebrows rose, and several nearby soldiers exchanged glances. "Son, you're the support staff. Administrative personnel stand over there." He gestured dismissively toward a small group of clerks and maintenance workers positioned well away from the main formation. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the ranks. Sergeant Marcus Rivera, a decorated infantry veteran, shook his head with a smirk. "Supply guys think they're real soldiers now," he muttered to the man beside him. Chen didn't respond to the comment. Instead, he simply nodded to Colonel Hancock and began walking toward the designated area for non-combat personnel. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, lacking any sign of embarrassment or frustration. To the watching soldiers, he appeared resigned to his lesser status. But Captain Janet Foster, standing with the company commanders, noticed something different about the way Chen moved. His stride was measured, balanced, with an economy of motion that spoke of deep physical conditioning. More intriguingly, despite being publicly demoted in front of his peers, his shoulders remained square and his head high. There was no shame in his posture, only acceptance. Colonel Hancock turned his attention back to the main formation, satisfied that order had been restored. "Now then, let's review the inspection sequence one more time. General Williams will expect to see." As the colonel continued his briefing, Sergeant Chen took his place among the administrative staff. The small group welcomed him with sympathetic looks and whispered reassurances. They understood the hierarchy. They knew their place in the military ecosystem. Combat soldiers were the stars, while people like them kept the machinery running in the background. "Don't let it get to you, Tom," whispered Corporal Lisa Martinez, a personnel specialist who'd worked with Chen on several occasions. "Hancock's just trying to impress the general. You know how he gets before these inspections." Chen offered her a slight smile. "It's fine, Lisa. We all have our roles to play." 20 minutes passed as the formation rehearsed their procedures. The combat units practiced their ceremonial movements while the support staff waited quietly on the sidelines. The morning grew warmer, and the tension in the air became almost tangible as the appointed time drew near. Then, precisely on schedule, a convoy of black vehicles rolled through the main gate. General Patricia Williams had arrived, and with her came her aide-de-camp, 2 military police escorts, and a small film crew documenting the inspection for training purposes. General Williams stepped out of her vehicle with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform bearing the ribbons and decorations of a distinguished career. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to take in everything at once. Colonel Hancock rushed forward to greet her, his earlier confidence now tinged with barely concealed nervousness. "General Williams, welcome to Fort Richardson. We're honored to have you here for our annual inspection." "Thank you," the general replied, her voice crisp and professional. I'm looking forward to seeing what your people have accomplished this year." As they walked toward the formation, General Williams' gaze swept across the assembled soldiers. She nodded approvingly at their bearing, their uniforms, their obvious preparation for her visit. But her attention was also drawn to the smaller group of support staff standing apart from the main formation. "Colonel," she said, pausing mid-stride, "why are some of your soldiers separated from the main group?" Hancock glanced toward the administrative staff and weighed dismissively. "Those are non-essential personnel, General. Clerks, supply technicians, maintenance workers. I didn't want them cluttering up the primary formation." The general's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I see. And they're all non-combat personnel?" "Yes, ma'am. Just support staff. Nothing that would interest you during the inspection." General Williams nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on the separated group. Among them, Sergeant Chen stood at attention, his eyes focused straight ahead, his expression unreadable. To most observers, he looked like exactly what Colonel Hancock had described, a quiet, unremarkable support soldier waiting patiently for the ceremony to end. But General Williams had spent 30 years in the military, and she'd learned to see beyond surface appearances. Something about the man's bearing caught her attention. It wasn't just his posture, though that was impeccable. It wasn't just his stillness, though he stood with remarkable composure. It was something more subtle, more intangible. There was a quality about him that she recognized from her years working with elite units, a kind of controlled readiness that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything with capability. It was the bearing of someone who had faced real challenges and emerged from them changed. "Colonel," she said, turning back to Hancock, "let's proceed with the inspection, but I'd like to speak with some of your support staff as well. They're part of your unit's success, after all." Hancock's smile became slightly strained. "Of course, General, whatever you'd like to see." As they walked toward the main formation, neither Colonel Hancock nor General Williams noticed the small detail that would soon change everything. Sergeant Chen, adjusting his position slightly in the warming sun, had unconsciously rolled up his sleeves just enough to reveal the edge of something that shouldn't have been there. Just beneath the fabric of his left sleeve, barely visible to anyone not looking directly at him, was a thin ribbon of light blue silk bordered with white stars. It was a ribbon so distinctive, so rare, that most soldiers would never see one in their entire careers. It was a ribbon that told a story Colonel Hancock had never imagined, a story that would soon transform everyone's understanding of the quiet man they had pushed aside. The inspection was about to begin, but the real revelation was still minutes away. General Williams began her inspection with the combat units, moving methodically through each company with the precision of someone who had conducted hundreds of such reviews. Colonel Hancock stayed close by her side, providing commentary and highlighting achievements, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a commanding officer eager to impress. The first company performed flawlessly. Their equipment gleamed under the morning sun, their responses to the general's questions were sharp and confident, and their demonstration of tactical procedures was executed with textbook precision. Hancock beamed with pride as Williams nodded approvingly at their performance. "Excellent work, Colonel," she said as they moved toward the second company. "Your soldiers clearly take pride in their preparation." But even as she praised the obvious competence before her, Williams found her attention repeatedly drifting toward the group of support personnel standing quietly in the background. There was something about the way they carried themselves, particularly the sergeant who had been singled out earlier, that continued to intrigue her. Sergeant Chen remained exactly where he had been placed, standing at perfect attention among his fellow administrative staff. Unlike some of the others, who occasionally shifted their weight or glanced around during the lengthy inspection, Chen's focus never wavered. His eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, his breathing steady and controlled, as if he could maintain that position indefinitely without discomfort. Captain Foster, observing from her position with the company commanders, noticed the general's occasional glances toward the support group. She had worked with Chen on several joint training exercises and knew there was more to him than his personnel file suggested. The man had an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure, whether dealing with supply shortages, equipment failures, or the demanding schedules that came with supporting active combat units. During one particularly challenging field exercise 6 months earlier, when a critical supply convoy had been delayed and the entire operation was at risk of failure, Chen had worked 18 straight hours to coordinate alternative transportation and redistribute resources. He had done it without complaint, without fanfare, and without taking credit when the exercise was ultimately deemed a success. "Sir," Captain Foster had tried to tell Colonel Hancock at the time, "Sergeant Chen's performance during the exercise was exceptional. He literally saved the operation." Hancock had waved off her comment. "That's what supply people are supposed to do, Captain. It's their job to fix problems quietly so the real soldiers can focus on mission-critical tasks." Now, watching the general's continued interest in the separated support staff, Foster wondered if perhaps Hancock's dismissive attitude might finally be challenged by someone with enough authority to make a difference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The inspection continued through the 3rd and 4th companies, each performing admirably under General Williams' scrutiny. She questioned soldiers about their training, examined their equipment, and observed their tactical demonstrations with the keen eye of someone who understood both the theory and practice of military operations. Sergeant Rivera, the infantry veteran who had made the earlier comment about supply personnel, was among those selected for individual questioning. "Tell me about your most recent deployment, Sergeant," Williams requested. Rivera straightened even further, clearly pleased to be singled out. "Ma'am, I completed a 14-month deployment to Afghanistan where I served as squad leader for 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company. We conducted over 200 patrol operations and maintained a 100% mission success rate." "Impressive," Williams nodded. "What do you consider the most challenging aspect of your deployment?" "Maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress, ma'am. Combat operations test every aspect of leadership and teamwork. It takes special people to perform when everything is on the line." His answer was confident, delivered with the pride of someone who had earned the right to speak about combat experience. Several nearby soldiers nodded in agreement, their own deployment experiences validating Rivera's assessment. Williams thanked him for his service and moved on to the next soldier. But Rivera's words about special people echoed in her mind as she continued the inspection. She had encountered many soldiers who fit that description over her 3 decades of service, and she had learned that such individuals didn't always wear their capabilities on their sleeves. Meanwhile, in the support staff area, Corporal Martinez quietly observed the ongoing inspection. She had known Chen for nearly 2 years, ever since her transfer to Fort Richardson, and she had always been struck by his unusual combination of competence and humility. Unlike many soldiers who sought recognition for their accomplishments, Chen seemed almost uncomfortable with attention. She remembered a conversation they had shared during a break in a particularly tedious inventory process. "Tom," she had asked, "how do you stay so calm during all this chaos? Some of these deadlines are impossible, but you never seem stressed." Chen had paused in his work, considering the question with the same deliberate thoughtfulness he brought to everything. "I guess I learned a long time ago that getting upset about things doesn't change the situation," he had finally replied. "You just do what needs to be done and move on to the next task." It wasn't much of an answer, but Martinez had noticed that Chen approached every challenge with the same quiet determination. Whether dealing with supply shortages, personnel conflicts, or equipment failures, he maintained an even temperament that seemed almost unnatural in their high-stress environment. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Chen's calmness came from experiences that made military logistics seem almost peaceful by comparison. The steady breathing, the controlled posture, the ability to remain focused for extended periods, these weren't just personality traits. They were skills honed in circumstances where failure meant death, where split-second decisions determined whether missions succeeded or families received folded flags. The morning sun climbed higher, and the temperature began to rise noticeably. Some of the soldiers in the main formation showed subtle signs of discomfort. Slight shifts in stance, occasional swallows to deal with dry mouths, the tiniest adjustments to uniforms that were growing warm in the direct sunlight. The support staff, standing in less prominent positions, had more freedom to move and adjust, and most took advantage of it. Chen alone remained motionless, as if the rising temperature and extended standing posed no challenge whatsoever. His uniform showed no signs of stress, his posture remained perfect, and his breathing stayed deep and controlled. To anyone watching closely, it was clear that this level of physical discipline came from something far beyond basic military training. General Williams finished her review of the 4th Company and turned to Colonel Hancock. "Your combat units are clearly well-trained and professionally led," she said. "Now, I'd like to spend some time with your support personnel." Hancock's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Generally, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I'm not sure that's the best use of your time. These people handle administrative tasks, supply coordination, and maintenance schedules, nothing that would really showcase our unit's combat readiness." Williams studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Colonel, in my experience, the strength of a unit is often best measured by the quality of its support elements. Combat soldiers get the glory, but logistics specialists keep them alive long enough to earn it." There was something in her tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. Hancock nodded quickly. "Of course, General, I just wanted to make sure we focused on our core mission capabilities." "I understand your priorities, Colonel. Now let's meet some of your people." As they walked toward the support staff area, Williams noticed how the administrative personnel straightened their postures and checked their uniforms. It was a natural response to command attention, but she was looking for something different. She was looking for the soldier who didn't need to adjust anything because he had been ready all along. Her eyes found Sergeant Chen immediately. While the others made small corrections to their appearance, he simply remained as he had been. Perfectly postured, completely prepared, utterly calm. It was the bearing of someone who understood that true readiness wasn't something you achieved in the moments before inspection, it was something you maintained constantly. "Sergeant," she said, approaching Chen directly, "what's your name and position?" "Sergeant First Class Thomas Chen, ma'am, Logistics Specialist, Supply Coordination and Inventory Management." His voice was clear and confident without being assertive, respectful without being subservient. There was something in his tone that suggested depths Colonel Hancock had never bothered to explore. "How long have you been in service, Sergeant Chen?" 12 years, ma'am." "And all of that time in logistics?" For just a moment, something flickered across Chen's expression. It was so brief that most observers would have missed it, but General Williams had spent years reading the subtle communications that passed between soldiers when words couldn't tell the whole story. "No, ma'am," Chen replied. "I've held various positions during my career." Colonel Hancock, standing nearby, looked confused. "Sergeant, your personnel file clearly indicates continuous service in supply and administrative roles." Chen glanced at the colonel, then back to General Williams. "Sir, my current assignment is logistics specialist. My previous duties are classified under different operational parameters." The words hung in the air like a challenge nobody quite understood. Hancock frowned, clearly puzzled by language that seemed unnecessarily complicated for discussing supply duties. But General Williams felt a familiar stirring of recognition, the sense that she was encountering something significant that others had overlooked.
"I see," she said quietly. "And what do you consider your most important contribution to this unit, Sergeant?" Chen considered the question with the same deliberate thoughtfulness he brought to everything. "Ensuring that people have what they need to do their jobs effectively, man. Mission success depends on every component working properly." It was a perfect answer for a logistics specialist, humble and mission-focused. But something in the way he said mission success suggested experiences with missions far more complex than supply coordination. As the conversation continued, neither General Williams nor Colonel Hancock noticed that Chen had unconsciously adjusted his sleeve again, and the small ribbon that had been barely visible earlier was now completely hidden beneath the fabric of his uniform. General Williams spent the next hour interviewing various members of the support staff, but her conversations only deepened her curiosity about Sergeant Chen. Each person she spoke with painted the same picture: Dedicated professionals who took pride in their work, but none with the unusual combination of qualities she had observed in the quiet logistics specialist. Corporal Martinez described her experiences working supply inventories with Chen. "He has this ability to see patterns that others miss, ma'am. When we're tracking equipment across multiple units, he can spot discrepancies that would take our computer systems hours to identify." Specialist Robert Kim, a maintenance technician, spoke about Chen's approach to problem solving. "The sergeant doesn't just fix immediate issues, General. He anticipates problems before they happen. Last month, he identified a potential failure pattern in our communications equipment that could have left 2 companies without radio contact during training exercises." Each testimony reinforced the same theme. Chen possessed capabilities that seemed disproportionate to his assigned role. But when Williams asked direct questions about his background or training, the answers became vague and uncomfortable. "Has Sergeant Chen received any specialized training that might explain his analytical abilities?" she asked Captain Foster during a brief private moment. Foster hesitated. "Ma'am, I've tried to access his complete training records for performance evaluations, but significant portions are redacted. Personnel tells me it's due to security classifications that are above my clearance level." Williams nodded thoughtfully. It wasn't unusual for soldiers to have classified elements in their service records, but it was uncommon for logistics specialists to require such extensive redactions. "What about his deployment history?" "That's even more restricted, General. I can see that he's completed multiple overseas assignments, but the specifics are completely blocked. When I asked him about it once, he just said he'd served where needed and changed the subject." The pieces of an intriguing puzzle were beginning to form in Williams' mind. A soldier with exceptional analytical skills, unusual calmness under pressure, classified training records, and redacted deployment history was not typical of administrative personnel. Her 30 decades of military experience had taught her to recognize when something didn't fit the official narrative. Meanwhile, Colonel Hancock was growing increasingly frustrated with the extended attention being paid to support staff. He had planned for General Williams to spend most of her time observing combat exercises and reviewing operational readiness reports. Instead, she seemed fixated on personnel whose primary contribution was keeping paperwork organized and supplies distributed. "General," he interjected during a lull in the interviews, "I've arranged for a tactical demonstration by our Quick Reaction Force. They've prepared a hostage rescue scenario that showcases our unit's rapid response capabilities." Williams considered the suggestion. "That sounds excellent, Colonel. But before we move to tactical exercises, I'd like to see how your support elements perform under pressure. After all, logistics coordination becomes critical during actual operations." Hancock looked puzzled. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what kind of demonstration would be appropriate for administrative personnel." "Something practical," Williams replied, her tone suggesting this wasn't a casual request. "Set up a scenario that requires rapid coordination between multiple units. Equipment shortages, communication failures, timeline changes, the kind of challenges that arise during real operations." The colonel's discomfort was evident, but he couldn't refuse a direct request from a general officer. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have my staff set up a logistics coordination exercise." 20 minutes later, a complex scenario had been hastily arranged in the unit's operations center. Multiple computer terminals displayed simulated crisis situations: a convoy stranded without fuel, medical supplies needed at 3 different locations, communications equipment failures affecting coordination between units, and a compressed timeline that required everything to be resolved within 30 minutes. The scenario was designed to test the entire support staff's ability to prioritize, coordinate, and problem-solve under time pressure. It was the kind of exercise that typically required team leaders to divide responsibilities among multiple specialists. "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Hancock announced, "you'll coordinate the logistics response. The rest of the support staff will assist as needed." Chen approached the central terminal and quickly reviewed the multiple crisis situations displayed on the screens. His eyes moved systematically across the data,
processing information with the kind of focused intensity that comes from experience with life-and-death decision-making. General Williams positioned herself where she could observe both Chen's performance and the reactions of others in the room. She noticed immediately that his approach was different from what she typically saw during training exercises. Most soldiers, when faced with multiple urgent problems, began by discussing options with their teams, asking questions about priorities, and seeking guidance from supervisors. Chen did none of these things. Instead, he spent the first 2 minutes in complete silence, studying the scenario with the concentration of solving a complex equation. "Time is critical here, Sergeant," Colonel Hancock prompted. Chen raised one hand slightly, not dismissively, but with the quiet authority of someone who understood that rushed decisions lead to catastrophic failures. He continued his analysis for another 30 seconds, then began issuing instructions with startling precision. "Corporal Martinez, contact the fuel depot at grid reference 347842. Authorization code Delta 79. Request priority delivery to Convoy Charlie's position. That's the shortest route for their emergency supplies mission." Martinez looked confused. "Sergeant, that depot isn't on our approved vendor list, and I don't recognize that authorization code. It's a Department of Defense facility with emergency access protocols. The code bypasses standard procurement protocols for crisis situations." As Martinez made the call, her expression shifted from confusion to amazement. The fuel depot not only existed, but confirmed the authorization code and agreed to immediate delivery. Chen continued rapidly coordinating solutions. He identified alternative communication channels that weren't affected by the simulated equipment failures, located medical supplies at facilities that didn't appear in the standard inventory databases, and restructured the entire timeline using contingency protocols that most of the staff had never heard of. Captain Foster watched in growing astonishment as Chen demonstrated knowledge of systems, procedures, and resources that weren't taught in logistics training schools. His decisions reflected an understanding of military operations that went far beyond supply coordination. "How does he know about those emergency protocols?" she whispered to another officer. "More importantly," came the reply, "how does he have authorization to use them?" Within 15 minutes, Chen had resolved all the crisis situations with solutions that were both elegant and efficient. The stranded convoy would receive fuel within the hour, medical supplies were being rerouted through a military hospital that could deliver directly to all 3 locations simultaneously. And communications had been restored using backup systems that few people knew existed. Colonel Hancock stared at the results in disbelief. "Sergeant, where did you learn about these emergency procedures?" Chen's expression remained neutral. "Various training courses, sir. Emergency logistics protocols are covered in advanced military education programs." It was another carefully non-specific answer, but General Williams was no longer fooled by Chen's modest deflections. The performance she had just witnessed didn't come from various training courses. It came from operational experience in situations where logistics failures meant mission failure, where the difference between success and catastrophe often depended on one person's ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. "Impressive work, Sergeant," she said, approaching the terminal where Chen was shutting down the simulation. "Tell me, have you ever been involved in actual crisis coordination operations?" Chen paused for just a moment before responding. "Ma'am, I've assisted with logistics support during various military operations." The careful phrasing was becoming a pattern. Every answer was technically accurate while revealing nothing about the real nature of his experience. But Williams had spent years working with special operations personnel, and she recognized the specific type of verbal discipline that came from dealing with classified missions. And these operations required security clearances above the standard level for logistics personnel? Another pause, longer this time. "Some assignments require additional security protocols, ma'am." Colonel Hancock looked back and forth between the general and his sergeant, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. "General, is there something about Sergeant Chen's record that I should be aware of?"
Williams turned to face the colonel, her expression thoughtful. "That's an excellent question, Colonel. Perhaps we should find out." She reached for her secure communication device, but before she could make the call, Chen's carefully controlled composure finally showed a crack. As he turned away from the terminal, his sleeve caught on the edge of the keyboard, pulling the fabric up his arm and revealing what he had been unconsciously hiding. There, just above his wrist, was a ribbon that made everyone in the room freeze in recognition. It was light blue silk bordered with white stars, attached to a small pin that was partially concealed beneath his sleeve. Even those who had never seen one in person knew exactly what it was, because it was the most distinctive military decoration in American history. It was the ribbon of the Medal of Honor. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. Every person in the room understood that they were looking at something that changed everything they thought they knew about the quiet logistics specialist who had just demonstrated capabilities that now made perfect, terrible sense. General Williams stared at the ribbon, her mind racing through the implications. Colonel Hancock's face went completely white as he realized the magnitude of his earlier dismissal. The support staff stood frozen, understanding that they had been working alongside someone whose true nature they had never imagined. Chen noticed the sudden silence and looked down at his exposed sleeve. For the first time since the inspection had begun, his careful composure slipped, and something that might have been resignation crossed his features. The secret he had been quietly maintaining was no longer secret. The operations center remained frozen in stunned silence as every eye focused on the light blue ribbon now visible beneath Chen's sleeve. General Williams felt her breath catch as the full significance of what she was seeing settled in her mind. She had seen only 3 Medal of Honor recipients in her entire 30-year career, and each encounter had been a humbling reminder of the extraordinary courage that existed within the ranks. Chen slowly rolled his sleeve back down, covering the ribbon, but the damage was done. The secret he had maintained through careful words and deliberate obscurity was now exposed to a room full of people who suddenly understood they had been witnessing something far beyond their comprehension. Colonel Hancock's face had drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to process what he had just seen. The man he had dismissed as non-essential personnel, the soldier he had ordered to fold towels, was wearing the nation's highest military decoration for valor in combat. "Sergeant Chen," General Williams said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of profound respect, "I think we need to have a private conversation." Before Chen could respond, Colonel Hancock found his voice. "General, there must be some mistake. Sergeant Chen is a logistics specialist. His personnel file shows no combat decorations, no special assignments. This has to be some kind of error." Williams turned to face the colonel, her expression stern. "Colonel, are you suggesting that Sergeant Chen is wearing unauthorized military decorations?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Wearing unearned military awards was a serious offense, one that could result in court-martial proceedings. But even as Hancock opened his mouth to respond, he realized the absurdity of the suggestion. No one would fake wearing a Medal of Honor, and the man standing before them had just demonstrated capabilities that clearly came from experiences far beyond standard military training. "No, ma'am," Hancock replied weakly. I don't understand how this is possible." Chen had remained silent throughout the exchange, his expression once again carefully neutral. But General Williams could see the conflict in his eyes, the tension between a desire for continued anonymity and the reality that his cover had been irreversibly blown.
"Sergeant," she said gently, "with your permission, I'd like to make a secure call to verify your service record. I suspect there are details that haven't been shared with your current chain of command." Chen nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. You have my permission to access my complete file." Williams activated her secure communication device and placed a call to the Pentagon's Personnel Verification Office. The conversation that followed was conducted in the kind of coded language used for highly classified information, but the effect on Williams' expression was dramatic.
With each piece of information she received, her bearing became more formal, more respectful. "I understand," she said finally. "Thank you for the clarification." She ended the call and turned back to the room, her demeanor now completely transformed. When she looked at Chen, it was with the kind of reverence reserved for the most elite members of the military community. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the assembled personnel, "I need to make some corrections to the introductions that were made earlier today." She walked directly to Chen and came to attention with the precision of a West Point cadet. "Sergeant First Class Thomas Chen, formerly Staff Sergeant Chen of the 75th Ranger Regiment, Delta Company, 2nd Battalion. Recipient of the Medal of Honor, 3 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, and the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster." The list of decorations fell like hammer blows on the stunned silence. Each award represented acts of heroism that most soldiers could barely imagine, and the combination painted a picture of someone who had repeatedly placed himself in mortal danger for the sake of others. Service record includes 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan, specialized training in advanced reconnaissance and counter-terrorism operations, and participation in classified direct action missions under Joint Special Operations Command. Captain Foster felt her knees weakened as the truth washed over her. The quiet, competent logistics specialist she had worked with for months was actually one of the most decorated soldiers in the entire military. Every calm response to the crisis, every moment of unshakable composure, every demonstration of analytical capability now made perfect sense. Williams continued her formal recitation. Sergeant Chen's Medal of Honor was awarded for actions during Operation Mountain Fury in Afghanistan's Kunar province, where he single-handedly held a strategic observation post against overwhelming enemy forces for 18 hours. Calling in airstrikes on his own position to prevent enemy breakthrough while protecting the evacuation of wounded civilians. The details hit Colonel Hancock like physical blows. The man he had ordered to stand with non-essential personnel had literally called artillery fire on himself to save others. The soldier he had dismissed as unworthy of the main formation had earned the highest recognition his country could bestow. Following recovery from combat injuries, Williams continued, Sergeant Chen requested reassignment to non-combat duties. His current assignment to logistics coordination was granted as recognition of his desire to continue serving while stepping back from direct combat operations. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Chen hadn't been assigned to logistics because he was unqualified for anything else. He had chosen logistics as a way to continue his military service while dealing with whatever personal demons came from years of combat operations that most people couldn't survive. Corporal Martinez was crying quietly, overwhelmed by the realization that the gentle, patient man who had taught her inventory procedures had experiences that belonged in military legend. Specialist Kim stood in absolute shock, understanding that every piece of advice Chen had given him about attention to detail and thoroughness came from situations where such qualities meant the difference between life and death. Chen himself remained motionless throughout Williams' recitation, his expression revealing nothing of whatever emotions he might be experiencing. But those who knew him well could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible change in his breathing that suggested he was far from comfortable with the attention. Sergeant Chen, Williams said, her voice now carrying the formal tone reserved for addressing heroes. On behalf of this command and the United States Army, I apologize for the failure to properly recognize your service and sacrifice. She rendered a slow, precise salute that Chen returned with equal formality. But even in that moment of recognition, his demeanor suggested someone who would have preferred to remain in the background, continuing his quiet work without fanfare or acknowledgement. Colonel Hancock approached slowly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Sergeant, Sir, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. Chen's response was characteristically measured. No apology necessary, sir. I chose this assignment because I wanted to serve quietly. The circumstances of today were unavoidable, but they don't change my commitment to the mission. His words carried no resentment, no anger at the treatment he had received. If anything, there was a quality of acceptance that suggested he had found peace in his current role, regardless of how others perceived it. General Williams studied Chen carefully, recognizing in him something she had seen in other highly decorated veterans. There was a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue, a kind of spiritual exhaustion that came from carrying responsibilities that most people couldn't comprehend. His choice to serve in logistics wasn't a step down from his previous assignments. It was a conscious decision to find meaning in service without the weight of life-and-death decisions. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I want you to know that your current service is just as valuable as your combat record. The Army needs soldiers who understand both the strategic importance of operations and the practical details that make them possible." Chen nodded gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you might realize." The formal revelation was complete, but its implications were only beginning to settle on everyone present. The quiet logistics specialist would return to his duties, but now his colleagues understood they were working alongside living military history. His advice would carry different weight. His calm demeanor would be viewed through the lens of experiences none of them could imagine, and his commitment to excellence would be understood as something forged in circumstances that tested the absolute limits of human courage. Colonel Hancock realized that his unit's most valuable asset had been hiding in plain sight, dismissed and underestimated because true heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and ceremony. Sometimes it chooses to fold towels and manage supply inventories, finding dignity in service regardless of recognition. The inspection was far from over, but everything had changed in the space of a few revelatory minutes. The aftermath of Chen's revelation created ripples that spread far beyond the operations center. Within an hour, word had traveled through the entire base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Soldiers who had passed Chen countless times without a second glance now found themselves trying to reconcile the quiet logistics specialist with the heroic figure described in General Williams's formal recitation. The immediate practical consequences were swift and decisive. Colonel Hancock, his authority undermined by the magnitude of his misjudgment, found himself facing questions from General Williams that cut to the heart of his leadership philosophy. "Colonel," Williams said during a private conference in Hancock's office, "help me understand how a Medal of Honor recipient ended up segregated with non-essential personnel during an official inspection." Hancock shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the confident bearing he had displayed earlier completely absent. "General, I was operating based on the information in Sergeant Chen's current personnel file. His assignment to logistics coordination, his lack of visible combat decorations, his preference for staying in the background, everything suggested he was exactly what his paperwork indicated." "And you never thought to look deeper? Never wondered why a 12-year veteran with his apparent capabilities was content with supply coordination?" The questions were fair but devastating. Hancock had made assumptions based on surface appearances, never considering that there might be layers of complexity beneath the official narrative. His failure wasn't just one of perception. It was a fundamental breakdown in leadership that had allowed him to undervalue one of his most experienced soldiers. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "I accepted the obvious explanation without investigating further." Williams leaned back in her chair, studying the colonel with the kind of penetrating gaze that made seasoned officers uncomfortable. "Colonel, this incident raises serious questions about your ability to recognize and utilize the full potential of your personnel. How many other soldiers have you underestimated because they didn't fit your preconceptions?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Hancock realized that his treatment of Chen wasn't an isolated mistake. It was symptomatic of a broader failure to see beyond rank insignia and job classifications to the human potential that existed within his command. Meanwhile, in the base dining facility, the reaction among the enlisted personnel was electric. Sergeant Rivera, who had made the disparaging comment about supply guys thinking they're real soldiers, sat in stunned silence as his squad mates discussed the revelation.
"Can you believe it?" whispered Private Johnson, his voice filled with awe. "A Medal of Honor winner was sitting right there in the admin office, and nobody knew it." Corporal Williams, a combat veteran herself, shook her head in amazement. "Do you understand what it takes to earn that medal? I've read the statistics. More people have climbed Mount Everest than have received the Medal of Honor. And we were making jokes about him folding laundry?" Rivera found himself replaying every interaction he had ever had with Chen, searching for signs he should have recognized. The man's unnatural calm during crisis situations, his ability to provide solutions that others couldn't see, his complete lack of ego despite obvious competence, all of it now made sense in a way that left Rivera feeling both humbled and ashamed. "I called him out in front of everyone," Rivera said, "made that crack about supply personnel thinking they're real soldiers, and the whole time he's done more for this country than any of us can imagine." The conversation was repeated in variations throughout the base, as soldiers grappled with the implications of Chen's revealed identity. Many found themselves questioning their own assumptions about rank, position, and the visible markers they used to judge each other's worth. In the administrative offices, the support staff was experiencing their own form of shock and adjustment. Corporal Martinez had spent 2 years working closely with Chen, and the revelation forced her to re-examine every memory through a completely different lens. "Remember that time the computer systems crashed during the inventory cycle?" she asked Specialist Kim. "Chen worked for 36 straight hours to rebuild the database manually. I thought he was just really dedicated to his job. Now I realize that kind of endurance probably came from much more serious situations." Kim nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And the way he handled that supply shortage last month. He found solutions that nobody else even knew existed. I figured he was just good at research. But those weren't standard procedures he was using. They were protocols for crisis situations that most people never encounter." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Foster, who had come to check on her personnel following the morning's revelations. She found her team in a state of odd confusion, trying to process the fact that they had been working alongside military royalty. "Ma'am," Martinez asked, "how long has Sergeant Chen been assigned to our unit?" Foster consulted her records. 14 months. He requested the transfer specifically for logistics coordination duties. "But why?" Kim wondered aloud. "With his background, he could have any assignment he wanted. Why choose supply work?" It was Captain Foster who provided insight into Chen's motivations, drawing from her own observations and the conversations she had attempted with him over the months. "I think," she said carefully, "that after everything he's experienced, Sergeant Chen wanted to serve in a way that helped people without requiring him to make decisions about life and death. Logistics lets him contribute to mission success while focusing on the practical details that keep soldiers safe and equipped." The explanation resonated with everyone present. They began to understand that Chen's choice wasn't a step down from his previous assignments. It was a deliberate decision to find meaning in service while stepping back from the intense pressures that had defined his combat career. Back in the operations center, General Williams was conducting her own investigation into how such a significant oversight had occurred. She had requested Chen's complete service file, including the classified portions that had been redacted from his current unit's records. The details she discovered painted a picture of extraordinary service under the most demanding conditions. Chen's Medal of Honor citation described actions that seemed almost superhuman in their scope and courage. During a Taliban offensive in Afghanistan's Kunar province, his observation post had come under sustained attack by a force estimated at over 200 enemy fighters. With his team wounded and evacuation impossible, Chen maintained his position for 18 hours, calling in artillery strikes and air support that repeatedly came within meters of his own location. When ammunition ran low, he had used captured enemy weapons. When communications equipment was damaged, he had rigged field expedient repairs under direct fire. The most remarkable aspect of his actions wasn't just the physical courage required to hold the position, but the strategic thinking that had allowed him to coordinate defensive fires while simultaneously organizing the evacuation of 37 Afghan civilians who had been caught in the crossfire.
His subsequent injuries had been severe enough to warrant medical retirement, but Chen had fought to remain on active duty. The compromise had been his transfer to logistics, where his analytical skills and crisis management experience could continue to serve the Army without placing him back in direct combat roles.
Williams closed the file and sat back in reflection. She had encountered many combat veterans who struggled with the transition from high-intensity operations to peacetime service. Some sought continued assignment to combat units, unwilling to step back from the adrenaline and purpose that defined their identity. Others left the military entirely, unable to find meaning in roles that seemed mundane compared to their wartime experiences. Chen had chosen a different path. He had found a way to continue serving while acknowledging his own human limitations and needs. It was, in its own way, as courageous as his battlefield actions. The general made a decision that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. She requested an immediate meeting with the base commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, to discuss personnel policies and leadership training that would prevent similar oversights in the future. "Colonel Hayes," she said during their conference, "today's events have highlighted some significant gaps in how we evaluate and utilize our personnel. I'm recommending immediate changes to ensure that soldiers with classified backgrounds receive appropriate consideration for their current assignments." She also made a more personal decision regarding Colonel Hancock. While his mistakes had been serious, they stemmed from systemic failures rather than malicious intent. Rather than pursuing disciplinary action, she chose to use the incident as a teaching opportunity. "Colonel Hancock will undergo additional training in personnel management and leadership assessment," she announced. "This situation will serve as a case study for how preconceptions can blind us to the capabilities of the people we're supposed to lead." As the day progressed, the initial shock of Chen's revelation began to evolve into something more positive. Soldiers throughout the base found themselves approaching their interactions with renewed awareness that everyone carried stories and experiences that might not be immediately visible. The man who had been dismissed that morning as non-essential personnel had become a catalyst for examining assumptions about worth, recognition, and the many different ways that people could serve with distinction. But perhaps most importantly, Chen himself seemed unchanged by the attention. He returned to his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his service, neither seeking credit for his past nor allowing the revelation to alter his commitment to his current mission. The true measure of his character wasn't found in the medals he had earned or the recognition he had received. It was found in his ability to continue serving with dignity and purpose regardless of whether anyone understood the full scope of what he had sacrificed for his country. 3 weeks after the inspection that changed everything, Fort Richardson had become a different place. The transformation wasn't visible in any official capacity. The same buildings stood in the same positions, the same routines governed daily operations, and the same chain of command maintained order. But something fundamental had shifted in the culture and consciousness of everyone who served there. The change was most evident in the interactions between personnel of different ranks and specialties. Soldiers who had previously maintained rigid hierarchical barriers began engaging with each other as individuals rather than job classifications. The revelation about Chen had forced everyone to confront the possibility that extraordinary stories existed within ordinary assignments. Private Rebecca Torres, a communications specialist who had been on base for only 6 months, noticed the difference immediately. "It's like everyone is paying attention to each other in a way they didn't before," she explained to her roommate. "People are asking questions, having real conversations instead of just checking boxes and moving on." The most dramatic transformation occurred within the support staff structure itself. Corporal Martinez had been promoted to team leader for supply coordination, and her first initiative was to implement a mentorship program that paired experienced personnel with new arrivals. The program wasn't just about technical training. It was designed to ensure that everyone's background and capabilities were properly understood and utilized. "We learned that you can't judge someone's potential by their current assignment," Martinez explained during the program's inaugural meeting. Sergeant Chen taught us that excellence can exist anywhere, and it's our responsibility to recognize and nurture it. Chen himself had become an unofficial advisor for the program, though he maintained his preference for working behind the scenes. His approach to mentorship was characteristically subtle. Rather than lecturing about leadership or sharing war stories, he focused on teaching practical skills while demonstrating the kind of quiet professionalism that had characterized his service. Young soldiers sought him out for advice on everything from career planning to personal challenges. Specialist Amanda Clark, struggling with the transition from civilian life to military culture, found in Chen a mentor who understood the complexities of adaptation without judgment. "He never tells you what to do," Clark explained to her peers. "He asks questions that help you figure out what you think is right, and he listens in a way that makes you feel like your concerns actually matter." Chen's influence extended beyond formal mentorship. His approach to problem-solving had become a model that other units began studying and implementing. The crisis coordination exercise that had revealed his capabilities was now used as a training standard throughout the base. Major Sarah Collins, the base training officer, had incorporated Chen's methodical approach into the curriculum for all personnel. What Sergeant Chen demonstrated wasn't just technical knowledge, she explained to a group of visiting officers from other installations. It was a way of thinking that combines careful analysis with decisive action. That's teachable, and it's applicable to any military occupation. The training program that emerged from Chen's example emphasized the importance of understanding systems and relationships rather than just following procedures. Students learned to identify patterns, anticipate consequences, and develop contingency plans that could adapt to changing circumstances. Colonel Hancock had undergone his own transformation during the weeks following the inspection. The additional leadership training that General Williams had mandated proved to be more valuable than punitive. Working with experienced senior officers who specialized in personnel development, Hancock began to understand the deeper principles of effective leadership. "I realized that I had been managing positions instead of leading people," he admitted during a confidential counseling session. "I was so focused on organizational charts and job descriptions that I forgot each soldier brings unique experiences and capabilities that might not be reflected in their paperwork." His new approach to command emphasized individual attention and development rather than simple task assignment. He instituted weekly one-on-one meetings with key personnel, not to micromanage their work, but to understand their backgrounds, aspirations, and potential contributions to unit effectiveness.
The change in Hancock's leadership style had immediate effects on unit morale and performance. Soldiers who had previously felt overlooked or undervalued began contributing ideas and taking initiative in ways that surprised their supervisors. The same personnel were achieving better results because they were being treated as thinking individuals rather than interchangeable resources. Sergeant Rivera had perhaps experienced the most personal transformation of anyone on the base. The combat veteran who had dismissed Chen as just another supply guy found himself confronting uncomfortable truths about his own prejudices and assumptions. Rivera requested a private meeting with Chen 3 weeks after the revelation, seeking both to apologize for his earlier comments and to understand how someone with such a distinguished background could find satisfaction in logistics work. "I need to ask you something," Rivera said during their conversation in Chen's quiet office. "How do you handle the transition from combat operations to this kind of work? Doesn't it feel like a step backward?" Chen considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness before responding. "I learned that service isn't about the intensity of what you're doing, it's about the value you create for others. In combat, I was making split-second decisions that could save or cost lives. Here, I'm making thoughtful decisions that help people do their jobs better. Both matter, just in different ways." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Rivera sharing his own struggles with finding purpose in peacetime assignments and Chen offering insights drawn from his experience with similar challenges. By the end of their discussion, Rivera had gained a new perspective on the meaning of military service that went beyond combat roles and visible recognition. The ripple effects of that conversation spread through Rivera's squad and beyond.
He began approaching his duties with renewed enthusiasm, viewing his role in training new soldiers as a form of service that could have lasting impact on their careers and safety. Captain Foster had also experienced significant changes in her approach to personnel management. The revelation about Chen's background had prompted her to review the service records of all her personnel more carefully, looking for hidden capabilities and unrealized potential. Her investigation revealed several cases where soldiers were underutilized relative to their training and experience. Specialist David Park had extensive computer programming skills that could improve the unit's data management systems. Corporal Jennifer Hayes had paramedic training that could enhance the medical readiness of field operations. Private Michael Chen, no relation to Thomas Chen, had a mechanical engineering background that could solve persistent equipment maintenance issues. We were sitting on a goldmine of talent, Foster realized. People had skills and knowledge that could transform our operational effectiveness, but we never bothered to look beyond their assigned specialties. She implemented a comprehensive skills inventory system that documented not just formal military training, but also civilian education, professional experience, and personal interests that might have military applications. The system ensured that future assignments and project teams could take advantage of the full range of capabilities available within the unit. The changes at Fort Richardson began attracting attention from higher headquarters. General Williams had continued monitoring the situation, curious to see whether the lessons learned from Chen's case would produce lasting improvements in unit effectiveness. Her follow-up visits revealed measurable improvements in multiple areas. Equipment readiness rates had increased as personnel with relevant expertise were assigned to maintenance roles. Training efficiency had improved as experienced soldiers were matched with mentees who could benefit from their knowledge. Problem-solving capabilities had enhanced across all functions as the methodical approach demonstrated by Chen became standard practice. This installation has become a laboratory for personnel development, Williams noted in her report to Army leadership. The changes implemented here could serve as a model for improving human resource utilization throughout the service. She recommended that other installations send observers to study Fort Richardson's evolving practices, particularly the mentorship programs and skills inventory systems that had emerged from the Chen incident. But perhaps the most significant change was one that couldn't be measured in statistics or formal reports. The base had developed a culture of respect for individual dignity and potential that transcended rank and position. Soldiers at all levels began treating each other with the kind of consideration that recognized everyone might have stories and capabilities that weren't immediately apparent. The dining facility conversations that had once focused on gossip and complaints now featured discussions about professional development and career goals. Training exercises became opportunities for cross-training and knowledge sharing rather than just task completion. Even routine administrative processes were approached with greater attention to how they could be improved through collaborative effort. Chen himself remained largely unchanged by all the attention and institutional transformation that had resulted from the revelation of his background. He continued his logistics duties with the same quiet competence that had characterized his service, neither seeking credit for the improvements happening around him nor distancing himself from their implementation. In quiet moments, however, those who worked closely with him could see signs that he drew satisfaction from the positive changes occurring throughout the base. The culture of mutual respect and recognition that was emerging with values he had always held but had never felt comfortable promoting openly. The man who had sought to serve quietly had inadvertently become a catalyst for changes that would influence military personnel practices far beyond Fort Richardson. 6 months had passed since General Williams first noticed something unusual about the quiet logistics specialist standing apart from the main formation. Fort Richardson had become a case study in organizational transformation, with delegations from military installations across the country arriving weekly to observe the cultural changes that had emerged from a single moment of revealed truth. The Richardson model, as it had come to be known in military personnel circles, represented a fundamental shift in how the Army approached human resource development.
The principles that had emerged from Chen's example, looking beyond surface appearances, recognizing hidden capabilities, and fostering individual potential, were being implemented at bases from Fort Bragg to Joint Base Lewis-McRae. Major General Patricia Hayes, who had been promoted following her successful implementation of the new personnel policies, often reflected on how a routine inspection became the catalyst for Army-wide reform. Sometimes the most significant changes begin with the smallest observations, she would tell visiting officials. In this case, it was one general's intuition that something didn't match the official narrative. The changes had created a new standard for military leadership education. The Defense Leadership Institute had developed an entire curriculum around the lessons learned from Chen's case, focusing on the importance of seeing beyond rank insignia and job classifications to recognize the full human potential within military organizations. Colonel Hancock, now commanding a training brigade at Fort Leavenworth, had become one of the primary instructors in this new program. His transformation from an officer who judged soldiers by their positions to one who recognized individual capabilities had made him uniquely qualified to teach others about the dangers of assumption and stereotype.
The most important lesson I learned, Hancock would tell his students, is that leadership isn't about managing organizational charts. It's about understanding that every soldier brings experiences, skills, and perspectives that can contribute to mission success if you're wise enough to recognize and utilize them. His classes featured case studies drawn from Fort Richardson's transformation, but always with careful attention to protecting Chen's privacy and focusing on institutional lessons rather than personal details. The goal was to help future leaders develop the observation skills and intellectual humility necessary to avoid the mistakes that had nearly caused the Army to overlook one of its most valuable assets. Sergeant Rivera had been selected for promotion to Staff Sergeant and assignment as a senior instructor at the Army's Leadership Development course. His personal journey from prejudice to understanding had made him an effective teacher for young soldiers struggling with their own assumptions about rank, position, and worth. "I used to think that combat experience was the only thing that mattered in the military," Rivera would tell his classes. "I learned that courage takes many forms, and some of the most important contributions come from people who choose to serve quietly and effectively without seeking recognition." His teaching emphasized the importance of approaching every interaction with curiosity rather than judgment, encouraging soldiers to look for the stories and capabilities that might exist beneath surface appearances. Captain Foster had been promoted to major and selected to lead a new Army initiative focused on comprehensive personnel assessment. Her work involved developing systems that could identify and utilize the full range of talents available within military units, ensuring that future soldiers would not be limited by narrow interpretations of their official qualifications. The skills inventory system she had pioneered at Fort Richardson had become standard practice throughout the Army, with modifications that allowed commanders to match personnel capabilities with mission requirements in ways that had never before been possible. We discovered that our greatest resource was being underutilized because we weren't asking the right questions, Foster explained to a congressional committee studying military efficiency. "Every soldier brings a unique combination of training, experience, and natural abilities. Our job as leaders is to understand those combinations and apply them effectively." Her testimony contributed to legislation that required all military branches to implement comprehensive talent management systems, ensuring that the lessons learned from Chen's case would have lasting impact on how America's armed forces approached human resource development. The transformation had also affected the younger soldiers who had witnessed the revelation firsthand. Specialist Clark, who had struggled with her transition to military life, had been inspired by Chen's example to pursue additional education in logistics management. She had earned her bachelor's degree through military education programs and was preparing for officer candidate school. "Sergeant Chen showed me that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to make a difference," Clark explained during her OCS interview. "Sometimes the most important contributions come from people who focus on doing excellent work rather than seeking attention." Private Torres had decided to extend her military contract and was pursuing specialized training in communication systems, motivated by the understanding that technical expertise, combined with dedication to service, could create opportunities for meaningful contribution regardless of rank or position. The ripple effects had spread far beyond Fort Richardson's boundaries. Military academies had incorporated the Richardson model into their leadership curricula, teaching future officers to recognize and develop potential in unexpected places. Veterans organizations had adopted similar approaches to helping transitioning service members identify and articulate the full range of skills they had developed during their military careers. Corporate leadership programs had begun studying the case as an example of how organizational transformation could emerge from individual recognition and respect. The principles of looking beyond job titles to understand human capability had applications that extended well beyond military settings. Chen himself had finally agreed to speak publicly about his experience, though characteristically, he focused on institutional lessons rather than personal recognition. His address to the Army War College had become required viewing for senior military leaders throughout the Department of Defense. "The most important thing I learned from this experience," Chen had told his audience, "is that service takes many forms, and each form has value. The Army gave me the opportunity to serve in combat when that was what was needed. Later, it gave me the opportunity to serve in logistics when that was what I needed. Both assignments allowed me to contribute to something larger than myself." His speech emphasized that the true measure of military service wasn't found in visible recognition or high-profile assignments, but in the daily commitment to excellence and the willingness to place mission success above personal ambition. The Medal of Honor ribbon that had accidentally revealed his identity remained pinned inside his uniform, hidden from casual observation, but serving as a private reminder of the experiences that had shaped his approach to service. He wore it not for others to see, but as a personal connection to the soldiers who had served alongside him and the civilians whose lives had been affected by their shared sacrifices. The base itself had become a destination for military historians and leadership researchers studying the practical implementation of personnel development theories. The Chen Conference Room in the administration building, named despite his protests, hosted regular symposiums on talent recognition and organizational culture. But perhaps the most significant legacy was one that couldn't be captured in academic studies or policy documents. Fort Richardson had developed a culture where every soldier understood that their worth wasn't determined by their rank, their position, or the visibility of their contributions. It was determined by their commitment to excellence and their willingness to serve others. New arrivals to the base quickly learned that assumptions about capability based on assignment or appearance were not just discouraged, but actively challenged. The story of the quiet logistics specialist who had been pushed aside only to reveal extraordinary service had become part of the installation's folklore, passed down through informal mentorship and shared experience. Dining facility conversations featured discussions about career development and personal growth, rather than complaints and gossip. Training exercises became opportunities for cross-functional learning and collaboration. Even routine administrative tasks were approached with attention to how they could be improved through collective effort and individual initiative. The transformation had created a working environment where soldiers at all levels felt valued and understood, where individual potential was recognized and developed, and where service was measured by contribution rather than visibility. General Williams, now serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, often visited Fort Richardson to observe the continuing evolution of the programs that had emerged from Chen's revelation. During her most recent visit, she had encountered Chen in the same logistics office where the transformation had begun. "Sergeant," she had said, "I hope you understand the impact your example has had on the entire Army." Chen had responded with the same quiet dignity that had characterized all his interactions. "Ma'am, I hope the changes help people serve more effectively. That's what matters." His answer captured the essence of what had made the transformation so powerful. It wasn't about individual recognition or personal advancement. It was about creating conditions where everyone could contribute their best efforts to shared objectives.
As the sun set over Fort Richardson, casting long shadows across the same parade ground where Chen had been dismissed 6 months earlier, the base continued its daily operations with the same professional efficiency that had always characterized military life. But beneath the familiar routines lay a deeper understanding of human potential and institutional responsibility. The man who had wanted only to serve quietly had become the catalyst for changes that would influence military culture for generations to come. His legacy wasn't found in the medals he had earned or the recognition he had received, but in the countless soldiers who would benefit from an army that had learned to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize the extraordinary capabilities that often hide in plain sight.
The greatest heroes, Chen's example had taught them, aren't always the ones standing in front of the formation. Sometimes they're the ones in the back, focusing on their work with quiet competence, waiting for someone wise enough to look beyond the obvious and recognize the true measure of human worth. In the end, that recognition had transformed not just one man's story, but the very definition of what it meant to serve with honor and dignity in America's Army. The documentary crew that had arrived to film the original inspection had inadvertently captured the most significant moment in modern military personnel management. The footage of Chen's accidental revelation, carefully edited to protect operational security details, had become required viewing at military academies worldwide. International military delegations from allied nations requested copies to study how a single moment of truth could reshape institutional culture. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, formerly Corporal Martinez, had been selected to lead the Army's new Global Personnel Exchange program. Her first-hand experience with Chen's mentorship had prepared her to teach other militaries how to identify and develop hidden talent within their own ranks. During a recent exchange with British Army officers, she had shared how the simple act of paying attention to individual capabilities could revolutionize unit effectiveness. The British were amazed, Martinez reported to her superiors. They discovered that their own logistics specialists included former engineers, teachers, and technical experts whose skills were being completely underutilized. The principles we learned here translated directly to their organizational challenges. The program had expanded to include partnerships with militaries from Australia, Canada, Germany, and Japan, each adapting the Richardson model to their own cultural contexts while maintaining the core principle of recognizing human potential beyond official classifications. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, formerly Captain Foster's deputy, had left active duty to pursue a doctorate in organizational psychology, focusing her research on how revelation moments could trigger systemic cultural change. Her dissertation, The Chen Effect: How Individual Recognition Transforms Institutional Behavior, had become foundational reading for leadership development programs across multiple sectors. What we discovered, Dr. Hayes explained during her defense, is that most organizations contain extraordinary capabilities that remain dormant because leadership structures focus on maintaining hierarchy rather than exploring potential. The Fort Richardson transformation demonstrates that the right catalytic moment can unlock human resources that dramatically exceed anything reflected in organizational charts. Her research had attracted attention from Fortune 500 companies seeking to improve their own talent management systems. The principles of comprehensive capability assessment and individual recognition were being implemented in corporations worldwide, with measurable improvements in innovation, productivity, and employee satisfaction. The economic impact of the Richardson model had proven substantial. A Government Accountability Office study found that military units implementing comprehensive talent management systems showed 23% improvement in mission completion rates, 31% reduction in equipment failure incidents, and 45% increase in retention rates among high-performing personnel. The financial benefits alone justify widespread implementation, the GAO report concluded, but the improvements in morale, effectiveness, and organizational resilience represent value that extends far beyond monetary calculations. Congress had appropriated additional funding for expanding the program throughout all military branches, with implementation timelines extending through the next 5 years.
The investment represented one of the largest personnel management initiatives in military history, all traced back to a single moment of accidental revelation. Chen's influence had reached into civilian veteran support organizations as well. The Veterans Administration had adopted modified versions of the Comprehensive Skills Inventory System, helping transitioning service members identify and articulate the full range of capabilities they had developed during military service. Employment placement rates for participating veterans had improved by 67%, with many finding positions that utilized skills they hadn't realized possessed market value. Michael Chen, the mechanical engineer private who shared only a surname with the logistics specialist, had leveraged his recognition to develop innovative solutions for military equipment maintenance. His designs for field-expedient repair systems had been adopted Army-wide, saving millions in equipment replacement costs while improving operational readiness in forward-deployed units. Sergeant Chen taught me that expertise doesn't have to come with rank or recognition, Michael explained during an innovation symposium. Sometimes the best ideas come from people who understand problems from the ground level and have the technical knowledge to develop practical solutions. The influence extended into military family support systems as well. Spouse employment programs had been redesigned to recognize that military families often contain additional reservoirs of professional expertise and capabilities. The comprehensive assessment approach had resulted in spouse employment rates increasing by 38%, with many finding positions that matched their qualifications rather than accepting whatever work was available near military installations. Children of military families had also benefited from the cultural transformation. Youth programs at military installations worldwide had begun implementing mentorship systems that recognized individual interests and capabilities rather than focusing solely on traditional activities. Young people were discovering talents and developing skills that might otherwise have remained unexplored. The theological implications had not been noticed by military chaplains, who found in Chen's story powerful lessons about human dignity and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. Chapel services throughout the military had incorporated themes about recognizing the sacred worth of every individual and the responsibility to help others discover their potential. The interfaith implications had proven equally significant, with religious leaders from multiple traditions finding universal principles in the narrative of recognition, transformation, and service. Military chaplains from Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and other faith communities had collaborated on developing programs that applied these insights to spiritual formation and community building. Academic institutions had embraced the Richardson model for their own administrative and educational purposes. Universities with ROTC programs had modified their leadership development curricula to emphasize comprehensive individual assessment and recognition of diverse capabilities among cadets.
Professor James Park at West Point's Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership had conducted longitudinal studies tracking cadets who experienced comprehensive capability assessment compared to those in traditional programs. The data is overwhelming, he reported. Cadets who receive individualized recognition and development show superior performance not just in academic areas but in leadership effectiveness and innovative thinking. The research had influenced civilian higher education as well, with colleges and universities implementing similar approaches to student development and faculty recognition. The principle that every individual possessed capabilities beyond their obvious qualifications had proven as applicable to academic environments as to military organizations. International peacekeeping organizations had requested training in the Richardson Model principles, recognizing that multinational operations required effective utilization of diverse capabilities from personnel with widely varying backgrounds. United Nations peacekeeping training now included modules on comprehensive personnel assessment and cross-cultural recognition of individual potential. The story had reached popular culture as well, though Chen had insisted that any dramatizations focus on institutional lessons rather than personal glorification. A PBS documentary series on military transformation had featured the Fort Richardson case as an example of how individual courage could manifest in choosing quiet service rather than seeking recognition. Hollywood producers had approached Chen about film rights, but he had consistently declined, maintaining that the real story belonged to all the soldiers whose potential had been recognized through the cultural changes that emerged from his revelation. "The important thing isn't what happened to me," he would tell persistent entertainment industry representatives. "The important thing is what happened to the thousands of soldiers whose capabilities are now being recognized and developed." The international media attention had brought unexpected benefits to Fort Richardson itself. The installation had become a preferred assignment for ambitious young officers seeking to experience innovative leadership development programs. Recruitment rates had increased significantly as word spread that the base provided exceptional opportunities for professional growth and individual recognition. Tourism to the local community had increased as well, with military history enthusiasts and leadership development professionals visiting to observe the ongoing transformation. Local businesses had benefited from the increased attention, and the surrounding civilian community had developed stronger relationships with military personnel as the cultural changes fostered greater engagement between base and town. The ripple effects had influenced civilian government agencies as well. The Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal organizations had implemented modified versions of comprehensive personnel assessment, recognizing that their own workforces likely contained hidden capabilities that could improve mission effectiveness. State and local government organizations had followed suit, with police departments, fire services, and municipal agencies discovering that their personnel possessed skills and experiences that could be better utilized with proper recognition and development systems. As Chen prepared for his eventual retirement from active duty, he reflected on how a single moment of accidental exposure had created changes that would influence military culture for decades to come. His preference for quiet service remained unchanged, but he had come to understand that sometimes the greatest contribution to institutional improvement required accepting temporary visibility for the sake of lasting beneficial change. The lesson that had emerged from his story, that extraordinary capability often exists in ordinary assignments, waiting for recognition by leaders wise enough to look beyond surface appearances, had become embedded in military culture at every level. From recruitment and training to promotion and assignment, the principle of comprehensive individual assessment had transformed how America's armed forces approached human resource development. The quiet logistics specialist who had simply wanted to continue serving had inadvertently become the catalyst for the most significant personnel management transformation in modern military history, proving that sometimes the most profound changes emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that true service often achieves its greatest impact through humility rather than ambition.